I want you to picture the most beautiful day of your life. Now imagine that right in the middle of it, right when the champagne is fizzing and the flowers are still perfect and the people you love most are gathered in one room. Someone reaches across that moment and tries to shatter it. Not with a shout, not with a scene, but with something far more calculated. A whisper, a smirk, and a few carefully chosen words designed to make the person you love most in the world feel like he doesn't belong there. That's exactly what happened at my wedding. And I want to be very clear before I tell you this story. I do not regret a single thing I did next. My name is Rachel. I'm 31 years old, and at the time of this story, I had been with my husband, Daniel, for 4 years. We met at a mutual friend's birthday dinner. He reached for the last bread roll at the exact same moment I did, and we laughed so hard that everyone at the table turned to stare. That was the beginning. For years of road trips and Sunday markets, of learning each other's coffee orders and deepest fears. He knew I cried at nature documentaries. I knew he sang badly and loudly in the car, and was absolutely unashamed of it. We were good together. The real kind of good. Not performance, not pretense. Just two people who genuinely made each other's lives feel larger and more possible. We got engaged on a Tuesday evening in November in the kitchen of our apartment, with no ring yet because Daniel had gotten so nervous that he blurted it out while we were making pasta. There was flour on his cheek. I said yes before he even finished the sentence. That is the version of our love story I carry with me. That is the version I wanted our wedding to honor. Planning the wedding was, I'll be honest, mostly joyful, occasionally stressful, and consistently complicated by one particular variable: Daniel's family. His parents, Gerald and Patricia, are the kind of people who enter every room with an invisible scorecard. They have opinions about everything, and those opinions are never shy about making themselves known. Patricia once spent 20 minutes at a family dinner explaining why the centerpieces at a cousin's wedding were aspirational without being tacky, which apparently is a compliment. Gerald speaks in a low, certain voice that is designed to signal that whatever he's saying is simply the truth and not up for discussion. They are, in the precise meaning of the phrase, a lot. I had always known they thought Daniel could have done better. Not because anyone said so outright. That is not how people like Gerald and Patricia operate. It was in the pauses. The way Patricia's eyes would scan me at family gatherings and settle with something that wasn't quite approval. The way Gerald would ask about my job. I'm a graphic designer, self-employed, with a tone that suggested he found it vaguely charming in the way you'd find a child's drawing vaguely charming. Not serious, not substantial, not the kind of thing their son should be attaching himself to permanently. But I could handle all of that. I had been handling it for 4 years. What I was not prepared to handle, what I had never once anticipated, was the way they would treat my father. My father, Robert, is a retired mechanic. He grew up poor, worked his whole life, raised me mostly alone after my mother passed away when I was 9, and did it all without complaint and without fanfare. He is not a man of grand speeches or elegant suits. He is a man of early mornings and calloused hands and a laugh so genuine it fills whatever room he's in. He is the reason I turned out okay. He is the reason I believe in showing up for people. He is, without competition, the person I love most on this earth. And at my wedding, on the one day that was supposed to be a celebration of everything good, Gerald and Patricia decided he was a problem to be managed. I need you to understand who my father is before I tell you what they said, because the insult only makes sense if you understand what they were insulting. My dad, Robert Calloway, grew up in a small town that doesn't exist in the way it used to anymore. The kind of town where 3 generations of the same family might work at the same factory until one day the factory closed and the town sort of exhaled and never quite caught its breath again. He left at 18 with $40 and a duffel bag, drove to the city in a car he'd fixed himself, and got an apprenticeship at a mechanic shop. He worked there for 7 years and then opened his own. 1 bay, 2 lifts, his name on a hand-painted sign over the door. He built that shop into something real. Not wealthy. We were never wealthy, but real. Solid. The kind of business where regular customers become friends, where people trust you because you have never once overcharged them or told them a part was bad when it wasn't. He ran it for 23 years. When my mother died, he ran it and raised me simultaneously, which is a feat I only fully appreciated once I became an adult and understood the weight of grief. He did it without falling apart, or if he fell apart, he did it only on the inside, away from me, so that when I came downstairs in the morning there was always breakfast made and someone to remind me that I was loved. He taught me to change a tire when I was 12. He taught me to cook 3 dishes really well because he said if you can cook 3 things beautifully you will never go hungry and never be boring at a dinner party. He came to every school play, every parent-teacher conference, every graduation. When I moved to the city for college, he drove 6 hours in each direction to help me move in, and then he sat in the parking lot for an extra 20 minutes because he admitted this later. He was trying to remember how to leave. He is the most quietly devoted person I have ever known, and every Everything good about me traces back to him. So when Daniel and I started planning the wedding, my only real requirement, the one I stated clearly and early, was that my father would be celebrated. He would walk me down the aisle. He would give a toast if he wanted to. He would be seated at the head family table. He would be treated in every possible way as the father of the bride, because that is exactly what he is. Daniel agreed completely. Daniel adores my father. That was never the issue. The issue was Patricia. The issue was Gerald. And the issue began, specifically 3 weeks before the wedding when they first met my dad at the rehearsal dinner. I had hoped that meeting would go better than it did. I had told myself that whatever private opinions the Davenports held about my family would remain private, out of basic social decency, if nothing else. What actually happened was that Patricia spent most of the dinner with her back half-turned toward my father, engaging him only when directly addressed and responding in the particular way that very polished people have of being technically civil while communicating clear disdain. She asked him what he used to do, past tense, as if his life had already concluded. When he said he was a retired mechanic, she produced a smile that I can only describe as the facial equivalent of a polite shrug, said, "Oh, how practical," and turned to refill her wine. Gerald was subtler, but in some ways worse. He asked my father a series of questions that were framed as friendliness but functioned as a kind of social audit, probing for the right schools, the right neighborhood, the right circles, and each time my father's answers didn't land in the right column, Gerald would give a small nod that meant nothing and move on. By the end of the night, my father had essentially been assessed, found insufficient, and quietly filed away. I watched all of this from across the table, smiling when I was supposed to smile, burning on the inside, telling myself it was one dinner, and that the wedding would be different. The wedding was not different. The wedding was where everything came to a head. The wedding was held at a vineyard about 40 minutes outside the city. It was exactly what Daniel and I had wanted. Warm, intimate, a little wild with climbing roses, string lights strung between old oak trees, a dance floor made from reclaimed wood. We had 90 guests. We had a bluegrass band for the cocktail hour, and a DJ who actually listened when you gave him a playlist. The food was good. The weather was extraordinary. One of those October days that seems lit from within, golden and unhurried, where the light does something generous to everyone's faces. My father cried when he saw me in my dress. Not dramatically. He's not a dramatic man, but his eyes filled, and he pressed his lips together and cleared his throat and said, "You look like your mother." That was the best moment of the day. That was the moment I will carry with me for the rest of my life. The ceremony was beautiful. Daniel cried too, which made everyone else cry, which set exactly the tone I had wanted. My father walked me down the aisle with his back straight and his chin up, wearing the suit we'd picked out together. Charcoal gray, no tie, because he finds ties uncomfortable and it's his daughter's wedding, so he should be comfortable. He looked dignified. He looked proud. He looked exactly as he deserved to look. The trouble started during the cocktail hour. I heard it secondhand at first, from my maid of honor, Sienna, who pulled me aside with a careful expression and told me that she had overheard something I should know about. She had been standing near the garden wall when Patricia and one of Daniel's aunts, a woman named Lorraine, had been talking just around the corner. They didn't know Sienna was there. And what Sienna heard was Patricia, in a low and confidential voice, describing my father as tragically unpolished and expressing concern to Lorraine about whether he would embarrass the family during the toasts. Tragically unpolished. Let that sit for a moment. My father, who raised me alone, who worked his entire life, who stood at that altar with more dignity in his silence than Patricia has ever produced in all her calculated elegance, was being described as tragically unpolished over canapes at my wedding by the woman who is now technically my mother-in-law. But it didn't stop there, because Sienna wasn't the only one. About 20 minutes later, my cousin Marcus, who had been near the bar, told me that Gerald had made a comment to one of his golf friends who was also a guest, something about how Rachel's side of things is a bit rough around the edges. But what can you do? Rough around the edges. My family, my father, the man who drove 6 hours to move me into a dorm room and then sat in the parking lot because he wasn't ready to leave. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment. It wasn't just anger, though there was plenty of that. It was something colder and more clarifying. It was the feeling of a person who has tolerated a great deal of small injustice over a long period of time and has finally, irrevocably, reached her limit. Every polite smile I had produced at those family dinners, every moment I had let a slight pass unremarked, every time I had told myself that this was just how they were, that it wasn't worth the confrontation, that I should be the bigger person, all of it collapsed in those 60 seconds, replaced by something very simple and very certain. My father was going to give his toast. Gerald was going to give his toast because that had been planned, and I was not going to disrupt the program. And then right after, right in that window while everyone was still standing with their glasses raised, I was going to say something. I didn't have notes. I didn't rehearse it, but I knew exactly what I was going to say, and I knew exactly why. Daniel, to his credit, I told immediately. I found him between the cocktail hour and the dinner, pulled him into a side hallway, and told him everything Sienna and Marcus had shared. His face went through several expressions in rapid succession: disbelief, anger, embarrassment, and finally, a kind of grim resolution. He said, "Whatever you need to do, I'm standing next to you when you do it. That is the man I married. That is exactly why." Dinner was served at round tables under the string lights, and for a while it was genuinely wonderful. The food was everything we'd hoped for. The band had transitioned from the cocktail set to soft background music during the meal. People were laughing and catching up and spilling wine, and doing all the things people do at a wedding when they are actually happy to be there. I moved through it all in a kind of clear-eyed calm, aware that I was waiting for something, carrying a quiet certainty, like a stone in my pocket. Gerald gave his toast first, as the groom's father. It was polished, as everything about Gerald is polished. A few well-assembled anecdotes about Daniel's childhood, a joke that landed comfortably, a raise of the glass. People applauded. Patricia looked satisfied. I applauded too, because I am not a monster, and because Gerald's toast was, in isolation, perfectly fine. The man can perform graciousness when he needs to. That is not the same thing as having it. Then my father stood up. He had written a few things down on an index card. I had seen him tucking it into his jacket pocket earlier that morning, trying to be subtle about it, which broke my heart a little. He put on his reading glasses. He looked out at the room, and for just a moment, he looked slightly terrified, which he would never admit, and which made me love him so fiercely I thought I might come apart at the seams. And then he spoke. He talked about the day I was born. He talked about my mother, briefly and beautifully, in the way that people who carry grief well can do, honoring it without drowning in it. He said that raising me had been the greatest work of his life, and that he hadn't always known if he was doing it right, but that looking at me today, standing here, happy, surrounded by people who loved her, he thought maybe he'd done okay. He said to Daniel, looking directly at him with those serious, straightforward eyes, "Take care of her, not because she needs it, she doesn't, but because that is what you do for someone you love." And then he raised his glass and said, "To my daughter, the best thing I ever did." There was not a dry eye at our table. There were not many dry eyes anywhere. My aunt was openly weeping. Sienna was weeping. Daniel was pressing his lips together hard in that way he does when he's trying not to cry. Even some of Gerald and Patricia's friends were visibly moved. My father sat back down, and I squeezed his hand so hard he laughed quietly and said, "Easy, Ratch." And then the MC moved to hand the microphone back, and I stood up. Daniel stood up beside me. He had promised he would, and he kept that promise. I smiled at the room, genuinely, because I meant what I was about to say with every part of myself, and I said, "I know it's a little unusual for the bride to speak at this point, so bear with me for just a moment, because there's something I want to make sure is said clearly and on the record." People smiled and settled back. I continued. "Most of you know my father, Robert Calloway, and those of you who do know him understand that he is not the kind of person who talks much about what he has accomplished or what he has sacrificed or what he has built. So I'm going to do it for him tonight because I think it matters that everyone in this room understands exactly who he is." I paused, not for effect, though it had that effect, but because I wanted to get the words exactly right. My father raised me alone from the time I was 9 years old. He worked 6 days a week for most of my childhood. He never once, not one single time, let me feel like I was less than anyone else's kid. He paid for my education. He drove across the country to help me move. He showed up every time, without fail. He showed up. My voice was steady. I had not expected it to be steady, but it was. I have heard, because people talk and sometimes they forget where the walls are thin, that some guests tonight have found my father to be. I let that word hang. Less than impressive. Rough around the edges. Unpolished. There was a shift in the room. An intake of breath. A few chairs moving. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Patricia's expression change. I want to address that directly because I believe in being honest, especially on the most important day of my life. My father built a business from nothing. He raised a child while grieving his wife. He has never asked anyone for a single thing he didn't work for. He walks into every room as exactly who he is. No performance, no pretense. And I've spent my entire adult life trying to be that kind of person. If that is unpolished, then I am deeply, profoundly grateful that I was raised by someone unpolished, because the polished version of a life I have seen tonight, the kind where you talk about people behind their backs at their own daughter's wedding, is not a version I want. I raised my glass to my father, the most impressive person I know, and the only standard I will ever measure a person by. I drank. Daniel drank beside me, and then, slowly, and then all at once, 90 people drank with us. My dad looked at me with an expression I will never have the right words for. It was not surprise exactly. It was something quieter than surprise. It was the look of a man who has spent a lifetime showing up for someone, finally realizing that the person had been paying attention the entire time. Patricia left the table immediately after my toast. Not dramatically. She is not a dramatic person in public, but she picked up her clutch with the deliberateness of someone executing a prepared movement and walked toward the venue's interior, and she was gone for the better part of 20 minutes. Gerald remained seated, with the expression of a man who's just been handed a document he didn't expect and is deciding what to do with it. He didn't leave. He sat very still, and he said nothing for a long time, and then he applauded, briefly and stiffly, in the way that you applaud when the social expectation of applause outweighs your personal desire not to. Several of their friends and family members came to find me throughout the rest of the evening, not to confront me, but to say something kind about my father, which I think was their way of distancing themselves from what had been said. One of Gerald's golf friends, an older man named Ed, found me near the bar and said, "Your dad's toast was the best thing I've heard at a wedding in 30 years. I thanked him and meant it. Daniel's younger sister, Jess, who has always been warm toward me, found both of us later and said quietly, "I'm so sorry. I knew they were being awful. I didn't know what to do." I told her she didn't need to apologize for other people's choices. She hugged me for a long time anyway. My father, for his part, handled it the way he handles everything. When the speeches were over and the dancing started, he found me on the dance floor, tapped Daniel on the shoulder with a courteous, "May I?" and danced with me to a song I've known since I was a child, one of my mother's favorites that I had asked the DJ to have ready. He didn't say much during that dance. He didn't need to. Halfway through he said, very quietly, "You didn't have to do that." I said, "Yes, I did." He nodded once and pulled me a little closer, and that was the end of that conversation. The aftermath in the weeks that followed was, predictably, complicated. Patricia called Daniel twice in the week after the wedding. The first call was ostensibly about thank you notes. The second call was more direct. She felt that I had publicly humiliated her at a family event. She used the word attack. She said that while she understood I was protective of my father, there were more appropriate ways to address concerns, and that what I had done had been embarrassing for everyone involved. Daniel, to his enormous credit, held his ground in both of those calls. He told his mother that he had stood beside me during that toast, deliberately, because he agreed with everything I had said. He told her that he loved her, but that what she and his father had done, speaking that way about Rachel's father at their own wedding, was wrong, and that if there was going to be a functional relationship going forward, it would need to begin with acknowledgement of that. Patricia did not respond well to this. There was a period of several weeks where communication was minimal and strained. Gerald, interestingly, was the one who eventually reached out first. He called Daniel, and then, unexpectedly, he called me. The call was brief and awkward and deeply imperfect, but he said the words, "I was out of line," with enough sincerity that I chose to accept them. Not because everything was repaired, it wasn't, but because holding a grudge against a man who is trying, however clumsily, to do better seemed like bad math. I am not in the business of permanent war. I was in the business of making sure my father was honored. That had been accomplished. Patricia took longer, much longer. She and I have reached a kind of functional civility now. We are careful with each other in the way that people are careful around something they know is fragile. She has never explicitly apologized. What she has done, however, is change how she speaks to and about my father in my presence, which I suspect is the closest thing I am going to get, and which I have decided is acceptable. The alternative is to spend the next 30 years at war with my husband's mother, and I have better things to do with those years. What I want to say to you, if you are someone who is reading this or listening to this because something about it resonates, if you have a parent who has been dismissed, underestimated, or quietly disrespected by people who judge worth by the wrong measures, is this: you are allowed to say something. You do not have to protect people from the consequences of their own behavior. Dignity is not quiet. Love is not always polite. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone is refuse to let the room pretend that what just happened was acceptable. My father worked his entire life and asked for nothing. He raised me with his bare hands and his whole heart, and he never once made me feel like I was a burden or a sacrifice or a problem. The least I could do, the absolute minimum, was stand up in a room full of people and say so. Not for revenge, not to win something, but because it was true, and because he deserved to hear it, and because sometimes truth is the only wedding gift that actually matters. Would I do it again? Without a single hesitation, without a single apology. There are people in this world who believe that class means knowing when to stay silent. I was raised by a man who taught me that class means knowing when the silence has gone on long enough. My father never had the language for that. He was too busy working, too busy raising me, too busy being everything I needed him to be. But I had the language. And that night, in front of 90 people with a glass of champagne and a microphone, I finally used it. To my dad, "I know you'll probably roll your eyes when you read this. I know you'll say I'm making too big a deal of it, same as always. But here's the thing about raising someone to believe they are worth fighting for. Eventually, they're going to fight for you too. That's not drama. That's just what love love looks like when it's paying attention. Thanks for showing me how.